The postcard sat face down beside my cold cup of tea, the corner of it damp where steam had touched. A hand had written a name that was almost mine, Sarah, but the last letter was wrong. Scribbled like someone who didn't take his time. I turned it over because I needed proof in my hands, not in my head. Some stories don't just tell pain, they reveal the truth. This is one of them, Sus, voice of aunt. How do you hold a small card and feel your life rearrange itself? It smelled faintly of citrus glue, that cheap travel bookstore kind. The picture on the front was of a place with two blue water.
And palm trees, leaning like they were whispering secrets. His looping handwriting above the stamp read, "To Sra, wishing you sunny days." No R, no A where it mattered. The kettle clicked and went silent in the other room. Eli was at school. Grace had left a single hairband on the stair that I told myself I would put away. The kitchen clock kept its polite tick, like an apology that never reached anyone. I folded the postcard back the way it had come and set it in the bowl where we put odd things, keys, receipts, the small kindnesses of a life that had learned to wait. When I met him, he was a man who promised the moon in a voice that smelled of foreign coffee. He promised courtside seats to every small victory, to every lost tooth. He packed a suitcase and called it work. He packed a promise and called it a plan. For years, his life fit into 2 suitcases, a phone, and a trail of stamps. My name, when it appeared, lived in the way he said hello at 3 in the morning or the way he folded a shirt. Little things, not labels. There was a ring of salt on the counter where someone, me, had spilled juice. I let the postcard rest on that damp circle, as if the moisture might make the writing legible again. It did not. Maybe he was distracted. My sister told me that afternoon when I held the card up like evidence. She was busy mixing a bowl of something for dinner and said it in the way people say small consolations, fast and practical. "He's always been bad with names," my neighbour murmured through the fence, her voice carrying the sort of sympathy that sits politely on the lawn. I remember the first time he left for longer than a week. Grace was still too small to button her own coat. Eli had drawn his father's plane on a scrap of cardboard and hung it in the window as if it might slow the turning of the world. I tied shoelaces. I patched knees. I learned the rhythm of a house that had only one steady heartbeat at night, mine. I learned how to make hot chocolate just right, and how to say, without panic, "He'll be back," in a voice that sounded like the truth and fell somewhere between truth and hope. He sent photographs from airports wrapped in captions like confessions. "Look at this sunset," one read. "Wish you were here." The children would press their faces to the screen, Eli naming every plane, Grace tracing a skyline with her finger. I kept those photos in a small box under the bed because the edges of them fit perfectly against my ribs when I held them at night. The box smelled faintly of dust and the lemon soap I used on Sundays. It felt like a secret altar for a life that needed proof. But the postcard, this tiny, careless slip, did something that all his long messages hadn't managed. It moved the feeling from ache into shape. Names matter. Not in the legal way, not for paperwork, but in the honest, daily way that gives someone place in your mouth when you speak. He could call the children by a nickname he invented and mean it. He could remember the peculiar way Eli arranged his socks and mean it. He could forget the shape of my first name and not mourn the loss. I did not throw the card away. I held it like a small fossil, something that would show what had lived and what had been lost. My hands learned to keep a steady calm. I put the tea back on, stronger this time, and watched the steam curl without thinking. There is a quiet that happens when you do not allow yourself to be surprised anymore. It is not acceptance. It is sorting. People asked how I managed. They looked at my hands as if the skin told a story that my words could not. "You're so strong," someone said once, with the soft reverence that people reserve for survivors and not for the ones who quietly rearrange the furniture of a life. Strength had become a polite costume I wore when company called. At night, I took it off and felt the splinters. I moved the postcard into a drawer where bills and school notices lived. That drawer became a small story shelf, proofs arranged like tiny, honest books. There was the postcard, a plane ticket stub he'd forgotten under the couch, a school photograph with his shadow barely in the corner. Each item was a slow addition to a truth I was building for myself, not for him. Before the children woke, I read the address again. My name, wrong in a single careless stroke. The fact of it made me laugh, a thin sound that surprised me with its smallness. Laughter is a kind of mourning, too. It loosens something tight enough to let air through. "How long are we waiting?" Grace had asked once, very directly, when she was 5. Her small hand on my sleeve felt like the entire world. I told her what had been told to me so many times, words that taste like sugar, and sometimes like ash. I said quietly, the kind of thing that fits in a single breath. Until you stop needing to wait. I folded the postcard and put it on top of that small shoebox of memories. The citrus scent lingered a moment longer when I closed the lid, as if the glue itself remembered something he had already forgotten. The years slipped in quietly. One meal, one bedtime, one fever at a time. If someone had filmed them, they would have looked ordinary. Nothing to hold, nothing to rewind. But inside the small movements lived an entire lifetime of waiting. Every morning began with shoes lined by the door, Grace's one always backward, Eli's always untied. Their laughter was the soundtrack of my days. The silence after bedtime was the proof that I'd survived another one. He called sometimes, his voice cutting in and out between airports. There was always a gate number, always a promise hanging just behind the static. "Soon," he'd say. The word fit easily in his mouth, so light it could travel any distance. At first I believed it. I marked calendars, drew little hearts on days he said he'd be home. But soon the pages filled with hearts that meant nothing, just red circles around air. I started keeping a small shoebox in the hallway closet. Every letter, every printed email, every photo he sent lived there. I wrote dates on the back of each one, not because I wanted proof of love, but because I needed proof of time. The letters began the same way, my dearest, and ended with promises that melted before they touched the page. Somewhere between soon and next month, I forgot what his handwriting looked like when it came from the heart, not the habit. The house learned to adjust around his absence. The couch sank only on one side now. The dining table felt wider. Even the clock seemed to tick differently, less sure of itself. Sometimes, after the kids fell asleep, I'd sit on the kitchen floor with a blanket and talk softly into the dark, as if the walls might answer. I'd tell them small things. Grace lost another tooth. Eli's teacher said he drew maps instead of colouring inside the lines. The walls didn't reply, but the quiet seemed to remember. He sent money regularly. Birthdays never passed without gifts, shiny ones that arrived wrapped in foreign labels. The kids learned to connect love with parcels that smelled faintly of ocean and customs paper. Eli started drawing planes everywhere, big ones with long wings that looked like freedom. Grace said she wanted to live where the postcards come from. I smiled, the kind of smile that tells children the world is still kind. One evening, when Grace had a fever, I sat beside her bed, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth. My phone lit up. Unknown number. I didn't pick up. I already knew what he'd say. Bad connection. Long trip. We'll make it up to you. He always made it up to us, in words. When her temperature dropped, I held her small hand and thought of how many nights like this would pass before he'd know the pattern of her breathing. I remember a morning when Eli asked, his voice small but sharp, "Mum, when does Dad come back?" I kept my eyes on the cereal bowl. stirring slowly, even though it didn't need stirring. "Before your next birthday, honey," I said. He looked at me for a long time, spoon in his hand, milk dripping unnoticed. "He said that last time." The words landed softly, like feathers, but each one cut. I reached across the table and brushed his hair from his forehead. "Sometimes flights get delayed," I whispered. He nodded, because children learn early how to protect their mothers. That night, I opened the shoebox. I took out one of the first letters, creased, yellowing around the folds. He'd written about missing the smell of our home, the way Grace clung to his shirt. The letter ended with a line that used to make my heart race. "Every day away is a day less of what we'll have left together." I used to read it like a promise. Now it sounded like math, something precise, not tender. I put the letter back. The box was almost full. I wondered if love had a weight limit. People around me called me lucky. "He provides so well," they said. "You don't have to worry about bills." They never asked about nights, about the way the bed stays cold no matter how many blankets you use, about the way a single toothbrush can start to look lonely beside the sink. At school events, teachers asked politely where he was. I smiled and said, "Business trip." It was the safest phrase in the world. No one questions it. No one expects more. Grace drew a family picture once for her art class. It was me and the kids holding hands under a lopsided sun. Off to the corner, she drew a plane with a man waving from it. "That's Dad," she said proudly. The teacher told her it was beautiful. I took the picture home and pinned it on the fridge. Every time I passed it, I looked at that small plane and felt the space between us widen. There was a time I used to stay awake until the clock hit midnight, just in case he called. Later, I began falling asleep earlier, not because I was tired, but because I had learned the shape of disappointment. It always looked the same, a glowing screen and silence. Sometimes I wondered what his world looked like. The photos he sent, city lights, hotel lobbies, dinners where people laughed too easily, felt like postcards from someone else's life. Maybe they were. I stopped asking questions about his trips. The answers never matched the tone. He'd speak of opportunity, of doing this for us. But there's a way people say us when they mean me. The days blurred into one long stretch of responsibility. I learned how to fix leaks, how to file taxes, how to keep the house standing on my own. The kids grew taller, their laughter sharper, their questions braver. My hair began to grey near the temples, something I noticed only when Grace called it silver. One night, as I packed their lunches, I realized I hadn't looked at a map in years. I didn't know which country he was in. I didn't even care to check. I just knew he wasn't here, and somehow that felt steadier than hoping he might be. I closed the lunchboxes, turned off the kitchen light, and leaned against the doorway. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. That sound, soft and endless, had become the pulse of my life. And in that small silence, I finally understood what waiting does. It teaches you how to disappear without leaving. I stopped counting calendars. I started counting silences. He came back on a Thursday, the kind of grey morning that doesn't promise anything. The taxi pulled up, and the children ran out before I could even wipe my hands. His bags hit the steps first, wheels scuffing the wood. Then that familiar voice, louder than memory, softer than truth. I stood in the doorway, holding the dish towel like it mattered, and watched his arms open wide. Grace's laughter broke something in me. Eli's face looked like sunlight after a long winter. He smelled different. Foreign cologne. Expensive, detached. The kind of scent that doesn't belong in homes where people live ordinary lives. He hugged me lightly, more formality than warmth, and said, "You look different." I smiled the way you do when you're remembering how to perform love. "You too," I said. even though I didn't recognize half his face under the tan. For a while, the house filled with noise again. Suitcases open in the hallway, children dragging out gifts wrapped in duty-free paper, laughter floating up the stairs. He told them stories of places with glass towers and beaches that never slept. They listened like disciples, eyes wide. I stood by the stove, stirring soup that no one would remember. That night, I decided to make a proper dinner. Candles. Plates that hadn't been used in months. The good napkins. I told myself it wasn't about proving anything, just wanting a moment that felt like family. He walked in while I was setting the table, talking on his phone, his voice clipped, efficient. He ended the call, glanced around and said, "You've changed the curtains." I almost laughed. They've been the same for 5 years. He looked up, half smiling. "Really?" "Huh." Then, as if to fill the air, "Place looks smaller." I poured the soup into bowls, pretending not to hear the small sigh that escaped him. Grace climbed into his lap. Eli showed him a drawing. For a moment, it almost looked right, like those framed family ads where everyone laughs at the same invisible joke. Dinner began with polite questions. "How's school?" "Do you still play piano?" He nodded and smiled, but his eyes kept darting to the phone near his plate. I caught him glancing at the screen between spoonfuls. The kids didn't notice. They were too busy retelling their small triumphs, Eli's spelling bee, Grace's dance recital. He clapped softly each time, as if ticking boxes on a list. When Grace ran to bring her drawing from the fridge, he looked at me across the table. "You've done well," he said, like I was a housekeeper who'd kept things tidy in his absence. I managed a smile. "We've managed." "Managed?" he repeated, rolling the word like he was tasting it. "That's good." Later, while clearing the dishes, I heard him laughing from the living room. The easy, careless kind of laugh I hadn't heard in years. I peeked in. He was on a video call, phone angled toward the children. "Yeah, that's them," he said, smiling at someone I couldn't see. "And this is the kid's mother." My hands froze mid-air. The plate slipped, landed safely in the sink, but the sound echoed. He didn't even look up. The kids ran off to get their toys, and I stood there, half hidden behind the doorway, listening to a voice I'd once believed in. The kid's mother. No name, just a role. It shouldn't have hurt so sharply after all these years, but it did. Clean, precise, like glass breaking in slow motion. When he hung up, I was still standing there. He smiled casually. "Sorry about that work thing. You know how it is." I nodded, though I didn't. I turned back to the sink. The water was too hot. My hands turned pink. The sound of running water drowned everything else. He came behind me, placed a quick kiss on my shoulder, the kind that feels rehearsed. "Thanks for dinner. It's nice to be home." Home. The word didn't fit anymore. It was too big, too used. After he went upstairs, I sat at the kitchen table with the dishes still wet and the candles half melted. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. Even the refrigerator hummed differently, like the house was holding its breath. I thought about all the words people use to describe love. Faithful, patient, unconditional. None of them mention exhaustion. None say what happens when the waiting becomes part of your bloodstream. I remembered how we used to talk until sunrise, before airports, before time zones. Back then, my name had weight in his voice. It had warmth. Now it was just paperwork, something you fill in when necessary. When I finally turned off the lights, the reflection in the window startled me. I looked older than I'd imagined. Maybe waiting ages you faster. Maybe forgetting does too. Upstairs, he was already asleep, phone charging beside him. The blue light from the screen blinked like a pulse that wasn't mine. I lay down beside him, careful not to disturb. He smelled faintly of his travels, metallic air, hotel sheets, something foreign. Grace's laughter echoed faintly from her room down the hall. For the first time, I wished it wouldn't. I didn't want her to grow up thinking this was normal. The house settled into its usual nighttime rhythm. Somewhere, a faucet dripped once, twice, then stopped. My hand brushed against his on accident. He didn't move. In that quiet, I realized something small but solid. He hadn't changed, not really. I had. I'd stopped asking for what I deserved. I'd become fluent in absence. I turned my back to him, eyes open in the dark. Even the walls stopped listening that night. Morning came like it always did, quietly, without asking if I was ready. The sunlight slipped through the curtains in thin, polite lines. I heard Grace singing somewhere down the hall, off-key, but full of joy. The kind of sound that almost convinces you everything is fine. He was still asleep, his breathing steady, too steady, like someone who'd never had to chase peace. I sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for the strength to start another day of pretending. His phone was on the nightstand, buzzing softly, almost shyly. I didn't move at first. I'd never gone through it before. For years, I told myself I was better than suspicion, that trust was what made me different. But something in me had been shifting quietly, like a picture frame tilting over time until it finally falls. It buzzed again. A small preview flashed on the screen. M. Can't wait to see you in Paris. The air left the room. My hands went cold, my chest heavy, but not from surprise, just recognition. That kind of message doesn't shock you when you've been living with silence for years. It only confirms what you've already been carrying. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Proof doesn't always demand a confrontation. Sometimes it just needs to exist. The clock ticked. The room smelled faintly of last night's perfume. His, not mine. I remembered how, years ago, he'd scribbled M. Hooked Monday flight on the calendar. He always travelled on Mondays. I thought it was a business code. Maybe it wasn't. I stood up quietly, walked to the window. Outside, the kids were chasing each other in the yard. The world looked exactly the same. Birds still moved across the sky. The neighbour's dog still barked at nothing, but everything inside me had rearranged. I went to the kitchen, started breakfast like any other day. The kettle hissed, the bread burned at the edges. He came down, hair messy, voice lazy with sleep. "Smells good," he said, sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone. His thumb paused once, maybe on that message, maybe on another. He smiled slightly at the screen. I kept my back to him. "You want eggs?" "Sure. Sunny side up." The pan sizzled, and for a second I thought about saying something, anything. But my throat tightened. I couldn't find words that wouldn't make me sound small. He glanced around, half curious. "You're quiet today." I managed a small laugh. "Just something overcooked." He didn't ask what I meant. He rarely did. The rest of the morning went through its motions. Kids laughing, bags zipping, the door closing behind them as I waved from the porch. Normalcy, the most convincing disguise. When the house emptied, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the phone he'd left charging on the counter. The blue light blinked again, rhythmic, constant, like a second heartbeat mocking mine. I didn't touch it. I just watched. There's a difference between knowing and seeking. One hurts once, the other keeps hurting. I poured myself a cup of coffee, though it tasted like nothing. The smell of burnt toast clung to the air. Grace's school drawing still hung on the fridge, our family under a lopsided sun. I looked at that paper and felt my chest hollow out. It hit me then. The years of pretending, the polite dinners, the postcards, the waiting, they all led here, to this kitchen, to this stillness, to a woman staring at a phone she wished she could unsee. I wanted to be angry. Anger, at least, has movement. But all I felt was exhaustion, the kind that sits deep in your bones and makes even breathing feel like effort. I opened the window to let the smoke out from the overdone toast. Cold air rushed in, sharp and honest. For a second, I wanted to cry, but tears felt like they would only blur the truth, and I wanted to see everything clearly now. The phone buzzed again. Once. Twice. Then silent. I turned away. That evening, when he came home, he noticed the dinner table was empty. No plates, no candles, just 2 sandwiches and a note that said, "Kids ate early." He didn't say anything. Maybe he didn't notice. Maybe he thought I was tired. He sat on the couch, flipping through channels. I watched him from the doorway. The man I once waited for, planned for, forgave for. He looked the same. That was the strangest part. Betrayal doesn't always wear a new face. It wears the one you trusted. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, he came into the kitchen. "You didn't eat?" I wasn't hungry. He looked at me for a second too long, then nodded, like that was answer enough. The silence between us stretched, not sharp, just wide, like a field you can't cross anymore. When he finally went upstairs, I stood there in the dim light. The faint smell of burned plastic still lingered near the stove from that morning. I hadn't noticed how strong it was until then. I opened the window again, let the night air swallow it. The phone charger's light blinked against the wall. I watched it until my eyes blurred. That's when something inside me settled. Not anger, not forgiveness, just certainty. I stopped cooking what he liked. I stopped waiting for his voice to sound like home again. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't scare me. It felt like mine. Would you forgive them if this happened to you? The day I decided to stop pretending started like any other ordinary morning. Eli couldn't find his shoes. Grace wanted her hair braided twice, not once. The kitchen smelled like burnt toast again. Small chaos, the kind that keeps you anchored when everything else wants to drift away. He was packing. Another trip. His suitcase open on the bed like an old habit. Shirts folded too neatly, as if order could hide what was missing. I stood in the doorway, watching him tuck in a tie he'd never worn for me. "Paris," he said casually, zipping up. "Just a few days." Paris. The word sat between us like something sharp. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He kissed the children goodbye, one on each forehead, the same way he always did. "Be good for Mom," he said, smiling. I waited for him to look at me. He didn't. The front door closed, and the sound of the taxi faded into the kind of silence that has weight. I packed the kids' lunches, combed Grace's hair, reminded Eli not to forget his art project. Every motion felt rehearsed, automatic. When the school bus pulled away, I stood on the porch longer than usual, feeling the morning air press against my skin. I don't know why I went to the airport. Maybe because I needed to see it, to stop being the woman who imagines and start being the one who knows. Proof has a way of forcing peace, even if it breaks you first. I drove without thinking, the radio off, my hands tight around the wheel. The world outside blurred into colours I couldn't name. At the departures gate, I parked, walked in, and joined the quiet flow of strangers saying half goodbyes. The screens above me flickered with cities: London, Dubai, Paris. My heart clenched at the sight of that word again. Paris. I scanned the crowd, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that he was already through security, that I wouldn't see anything at all. Then I saw him. He was standing near the ticket counter, laughing, that laugh I used to know by heartbeat. His hand rested lightly on the shoulder of a woman, tall, polished, the kind of beauty that doesn't try. She held his arm like it belonged there. They looked comfortable, familiar, like people who don't have to explain themselves. He leaned closer, said something, and she touched his face gently, brushing a hair off his forehead. My breath caught. It wasn't anger I felt. It was a strange, hollow stillness, like the moment after thunder when the air hasn't decided what to do next. I took one step back, then another, until I found the nearest pillar to hide behind. My fingers dug into the strap of my bag. My heart should have been racing, but it wasn't. It just steadied, like it had finally aligned with a truth it already knew. The announcement came over the speakers. Flight 228 to Paris now boarding. He picked up her suitcase, laughing again. They walked toward the gate together, shoulders brushing. She turned slightly, and for the first time I saw her face clearly. The same M I'd read on his phone screen now had a heartbeat, a perfume, a life that fit easily beside his. I didn't cry. Not then. Not there. I just stood in that crowded terminal, invisible, watching the life I built walk away wearing someone else's smile. He paused at the gate, pulled out his phone. I saw his mouth move, words I didn't need to hear. Maybe he was telling her kids he'd call later. Maybe he was replying to me. I'll never know. He didn't look back. The line moved, the doors closed, and the world resumed its ordinary rhythm. Announcements, rolling suitcases, people checking watches. I sat on a bench near the glass wall, staring at the runway. The planes looked like silver promises breaking through clouds. I thought of Grace's drawings, Eli's toy airplanes, the way they believed their father touched the sky for them. I wanted to protect that illusion a little longer. They didn't deserve to lose faith yet. So I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, opened the camera quietly. One quick photo, his hand in hers. Proof. Not for revenge, not for confrontation, for memory, for clarity. I didn't send it to anyone. I just saved it and slid the phone back. Proof doesn't always need to shout. It just needs to stay. The air conditioning blew cold against my face, drying the tears I hadn't realized had started to fall. I wiped them away, slow, careful, like tending to a wound that would heal crooked. Outside, the plane began to move, small lights blinking against the grey morning. I whispered something I didn't plan to say. Safe travels. The words came out steady, honest, like a farewell that had been waiting for years. When I walked back to my car, the sun was already climbing, cutting the airport glass into pieces of light. I felt lighter too. Not happy, not sad, just emptied. Sometimes truth doesn't free you. It just gives you something solid to stand on after you've been drifting too long. By the time I reached home, the kids were still at school. The house was silent except for the ticking clock. Same sound, new meaning. I sat at the kitchen table, opened my shoebox of letters, postcards, photos, small proofs of loyalty that had expired quietly. I placed the airport photo on top of the pile, shut the lid, and pushed it to the back of the drawer. I didn't need to look anymore. I already knew. That evening, I tucked the kids into bed, listened to Grace whisper, "When will Dad call?" I brushed her hair from her face and smiled softly. "Soon," I said, my voice steady, gentle. She smiled back, already half asleep. In the darkness, I whispered to myself, words that no one else would ever hear. Some departures don't need goodbyes. Then I turned off the light and let the quiet settle around me, not as loneliness this time, but as truth finally finding its shape. Time didn't heal anything. It just rearranged the pain into quieter corners. Months passed after that airport morning. I didn't tell anyone. Not my sister, not the children. Secrets, I've learned, can grow roots if you water them with silence. He still called. Not often, not long. The same hollow routine. Check on the kids, ask about bills, end with, "Take care." No mention of love, no apology, Not even the faint curiosity of someone who'd once known how I took my tea. But I'd changed. Something inside me had shifted from waiting to watching. I started rebuilding without announcing it. I found work again, part-time at the library. The smell of old books, the steady hush, the way stories sat obediently on shelves. It calmed me. The librarian, a quiet man named Peter, once told me, "You're good at finding what people didn't know they needed." He meant novels, but maybe he was right in other ways too. The children grew fast. Eli entered middle school, his voice starting to crack, his drawings sharper. Grace danced in the living room, spinning to songs she half understood. Life kept moving, even when I didn't. Then one morning, an envelope arrived. Cream paper, official lettering. I recognized his handwriting before I opened it. Inside, joint account adjustment, authorization request. He'd sent it by mistake, the note said. Just a banking form, he claimed, something his assistant must have mailed in error. I stared at it, long and hard. The form transferred access, moved balances, listed addresses I didn't recognize. The kind of mistake that has intention written all over it. I took a deep breath, folded it neatly, and went to the bank myself. The teller looked confused when I asked for the reversal form. "It happens," she said kindly. "People forget who's on their papers sometimes." Forget, that word again. It had become his second language. I signed my full name slowly, carefully. The pen scratched against the counter louder than I expected, echoing in my ears. It felt final, like reclaiming something invisible. When I walked out into the street, the air was cold, but the sun was bright. I held my scarf tight and realized it was the first time in years I hadn't felt smaller walking away from his mess. Weeks later, a new proof arrived. Grace brought home a school form, one of those emergency contact sheets. "Dad filled this when he visited?" she said casually. "He came to pick us up when you were late that day." I glanced at the paper, smiling automatically. Then I froze. Under Guardian, Sarah B. Not my name. Not even close. My name, my full, real name, was nowhere on that form. Not as mother, not as anything. Just Sarah B., as if I'd been edited out of my own life by someone too careless to spell me correctly. I stared at the paper until the ink blurred. Grace was watching me, a little unsure. "It's okay, Mom," she said. "Maybe he just wrote fast." "Maybe," I whispered. My throat ached, but I smiled for her. "You finish your homework, sweetheart." When she left the room, I sat there a long time, holding that paper like a final verdict. The kind of proof that doesn't shout, doesn't accuse, it just erases. That night, I took the shoebox from the drawer, spread everything across the table. The postcards, the airport photo, the letters, the old calendar notes. I realized it wasn't a record of love anymore. It was evidence of forgetting. A slow, deliberate undoing of a woman who gave everything and received absence in return. He hadn't just left. He'd rewritten the story so that I didn't exist inside it. I thought I'd feel rage. But what came instead was stillness. Like I was finally done defending a name someone else had stopped saying. A few days later, his new partner, M, emailed me. The subject line read, "Just wanted to say thank you." Her message was polite, kind even. She thanked me for everything I'd done for him and the kids. She said she hoped we could all be part of each other's extended family one day. I read it 3 times, not out of anger, but disbelief. How soft betrayal can sound when written in perfect grammar. I didn't reply. There are silences more powerful than any answer. The next morning, I went to the children's rooms before they woke up. I watched them breathe, their faces still untouched by everything they'd inherit from our story. I brushed Grace's hair back and whispered, Remember who you are, always. No one gets to rename you. In the kitchen, the first light of dawn hit the table where the papers still lay. I picked up that school form one last time and signed underneath his handwriting. Mother, Sarah Whitmore. Full name, firm stroke. No tremor. The pen scratched loudly again, steady, certain. For a moment, even the clock seemed to stop to listen. I folded the paper, slipped it into the drawer with the rest, then closed it for good. Outside, the world was waking. A bird landed on the window ledge, tapping once before flying away. The air carried that faint scent of winter, the kind that bites but cleans. I poured myself coffee, no sugar. I liked the bitterness now. It reminded me I could taste again. For the first time in years, I didn't check my phone. I didn't expect a message. I didn't wait for an apology that would never arrive. Later that day at the library, I shelved books about self-reliance and quiet courage. One of the covers caught my eye. Its title said, Becoming Visible. I smiled faintly, slipped it onto the right shelf, and whispered to myself, Exactly. That night, when the kids were asleep, I sat by the window with the lights off. The moonlight fell across the floor like silver lace. Somewhere in another country, he was probably sitting beside Em, telling stories, smiling that same smile. It didn't matter. Not anymore. Some erasures aren't mistakes. They're endings. I'd been erased from his story. So I started writing mine. Years slipped by the way dust settles on old furniture. Softly, without asking permission. The house grew quieter, lighter. Grace left for college with a suitcase full of nerves and laughter. Eli started driving, then working part-time at a music store. The rooms they left behind still smelled faintly of their childhood. Crayons, shampoo, the echoes of small feet on wooden floors. I kept the same kitchen table all these years. The same one where I'd once waited for calls that never came. Its surface was scratched now, proof of time, not neglect, proof that life went on. He came back only once after that, Grace's graduation. The ceremony was held in a hall that smelled of flowers and borrowed perfume. I saw him across the room, greyer, slower, still wrapped in that air of easy confidence. His new wife stood beside him, Em in real flesh and calm poise, her arm looped lightly through his. He noticed me a moment later. Our eyes met. Just long enough for politeness, not memory. He walked over, smiling the way people do when they aren't sure what's appropriate. Sarah, he said, his voice soft but uncertain. It's been years. I nodded, holding my purse a little tighter. Yes, I said quietly. It has. He looked at Grace on the stage and laughed lightly. You did well. She's a wonderful young woman. I smiled. She raised herself, mostly. He hesitated, maybe catching the truth in my tone, maybe not. Then he said something I'll never forget. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't anymore. I'm proud of us, he said. We made a good family. Us. The word felt misplaced, like a borrowed coat on the wrong shoulders. Before I could respond, they called Grace's name. She walked across the stage, cap slightly crooked, smile too big for her face. For a moment, everything else faded. Him, the years, the ache. All I saw was her, the child I'd raised through storms of silence and small victories. When the applause ended, I clapped until my palms stung. After the ceremony, we all stood for photos, the polite, public kind, Grace in the middle, her father on one side, me on the other. He looked at the camera and said, Come on, family picture. I smiled, because why not? Sometimes peace wears the same face as surrender. He called me dear friend when introducing me to Em. She extended her hand, warm, steady. It's lovely to finally meet you. she said sincerely. And for once, I believed her. She didn't owe me my history. He did. We posed, smiled, clapped again when Grace threw her cap into the air. The sun caught in her hair, and I felt something unclench in my chest. After everyone dispersed, he came to me once more, holding a program folded neatly in half. "You still live in the same house?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded thoughtfully, like a man making small talk with a neighbor. "If you ever need anything," I smiled gently. "I used to. Not anymore." He smiled back, but his eyes drifted elsewhere, to M, to the new life waiting at the car. He patted my shoulder, awkward, formal. Then he walked away, his hand sliding easily back into hers. I stood there for a long time, the air full of laughter and photographs. The wind caught the tassels of Grace's cap lying on the grass, spinning it once before it fell still. That's how closure really comes, not with grand gestures, but with small things that stop moving. That night, back home, the house felt vast again. I made tea, opened a window, and listened to the city hum faintly in the distance. On the wall, the family photos still hung, untouched. I didn't remove him. I didn't need to. The past deserves its frame. It just doesn't deserve my grief anymore. The shoebox was gone, burned quietly one evening a year before. I didn't watch it turn to ash. I just knew it was time. Grace called later that night. "Mom, you okay?" "I'm fine," I said, and this time I meant it. When the call ended, I sat on the couch, eyes closed, letting the warmth of the tea settle into my hands. I thought of everything: the postcard, the dinners, the lies, the small kindnesses that used to feel like proof. And then I thought of my name, written clearly now in every form, every memory that mattered. I stayed silent, but the truth found its voice. Stories like this never fade. Voice of Aunt. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like an old lullaby. I leaned back, listening, and smiled. I didn't win anything. I just stopped losing myself.